Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me. My name's Tim Roby. I'm a film critic for The Telegraph. I was very, very honoured and privileged to see this film back in May and review it and to interview Brett Morgen for it in Cannes. And I'm glad you've stayed so we can hear from the man himself and his sound team. It's especially rare and exciting to be able to talk to the people behind the sound of a film for once. It's quite an unusual situation for a moderator, so this is good. Could you first, though, join me in welcoming the maestro himself, Brett Morgen, director of the film. Hello. And we have the three sort of senior members of his sound team. First of all, mixer extraordinaire Paul Massey. And his fellow Oscar winners for their work on Bohemian Rhapsody, we have the editors Nina Hartstone and John Warhurst. Thank you so much, guys, for joining us for this. And I hope everyone had the overwhelming experience that I did when I saw it twice back then. I remember when we met in Cannes, in fact, one of the things you said was about the sound mix, because you were doing the test that you have to do in the Grand Palais de Festival, one of the biggest screens in the world, which I think has like 10.1 Dolby or something. You'd have to tell me the specifics on that. But you were like, our sound mix is out of control. I don't know if you've realized it's out of control. So what I want to ask you first is, how do you manage to maintain control when you want it to be out of control? And how did these guys get involved with that?
Well, Paul is really the one to answer that question. I think he was the one who really kept things grounded and right. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, I don't know how much I should say, Brett. It was obviously one of the biggest challenges, I think, was taking all of the audio from various decades and all of the different qualities of material that we had, both for dialogue, sound effects, well, dialogue and music. Some of them we were back to 24 tracks and doing complete remixes on the songs, and others we were hindered by, like Rock and Roll With Me. We had just a 2-track. I think that was from a beta. Is that right? So the whole trying to keep everything even, we would go through sections of the film and try to even them out as scenes or sequences, and then we'd have to go almost back to the top and screen it and just see how uneven we were throughout the whole film, just to try and make sure that everything stayed consistent. And then the question of overall level, of course, was something that we got into a lot of ups and downs on. It's a bold film. It's very immersive, and we had to make sure we didn't get too loud.
So back to you for a second, Brett. When you brought in this team, obviously some of the best people in the business, what was the kind of overall brief or agenda that you set for them?
Well, it's a little different for Paul and a little different for John and Nina. I think with John and Nina, who Paul brought in, we spotted the film. I think we did it in 7 or 9 sessions, and I think the main, I'd say, characterization of those meetings was trying to create a dialogue that wasn't about creating sounds that are, literally mimic the images on screen, but to take a more kind of liberal interpretation, moment to moment, that the picture, when we locked picture, was really just a shell, just a kind of starting point. And I'd like to say the film was written 3 times. It was written before I got to the edit, and then it was written with John and Nina, and then written again with Paul. And so a lot of our discussions were really abstract sounds and psychological sounds. And then as it relates to Paul, from conception, the idea was to take the audio into the room, not to sort of support what was on the screen, but as the sort of reason we were existing, to create this kind of really unexpected immersive audio experience. And so in terms of it being out of control, I think once you start to play with those speakers, and they could speak to this much more than I can, once you leave the stage, each room's a little different. And so I think Paul's understanding of how the ultimate mix would translate into different spaces and rooms was essential for allowing us to sort of take very aggressive and audacious risks.
Nina, I'm going to come to you next. Can you talk us through the process? I think 18 months or so, is that about right? That you had to work on the material, and how did it come to you first? How did it all compare to itself, as it were? What range of footage were we looking at, and how did you manage to meld these things together?
Well, as Brett was saying, we spent an awful lot of time. Our first steps were speaking with Brett in great detail over a long period, and starting those collaborative conversations about what the sound would be on this film, and understanding all that Brett had learned through going through all the material, and all of the material he had access to, and learning more about David and the David that we're representing in this film. And we really were trying to sort of drill down into what that would mean for the sound, how we would use the sound to try and create the David that we see in Moonage Daydream, try and get into his head, try and show how his relationship with the audiences that he's had over the years, how that has evolved and how that has changed, and how every performance that he gave, and he says it himself in the film, I mean, the energy in that room in each individual performance, even across various nights of the same tour, there would be a different vibe in there, and we really wanted to try and recreate that in the work that we were doing.
Thank you. John, now for the likes of me, a layman in the world of sound editing, can you explain how your collaboration with Nina works specifically? How did you kind of decide who was going to work on what? Are you looking over each other's shoulders most steps of the way, or how does it work?
Well, yeah, I think we're always looking over each other's shoulders. I think we're always commenting on each other's sort of work. I tend to do sort of more the kind of effects, music side. Nina does a lot of kind of the dialogue of the crowd side, and we meet in the middle. I think on the sort of crowd design side, and so we're always. I think it's a great way of working as well, and not only for ourselves, but allowing sort of everybody to be able to sort of contribute, or for it to be a very sort of open forum as to what people think. I think that's so, but it mainly comes back down to me and Nina about what we think, about what we want to put forwards and things like that.
Well, since we've got you here, I kind of want to nerd out a little bit about some Bowie songs and specific moments in the film. Perhaps Brett can guide me towards the right person to ask. But one sequence that immediately floored me when I saw it was the sound and vision sequence, which is quite relevant to our discussion, because clearly the song dictates the visuals, but then do the visuals dictate back to the mix and back to the song in terms of the way you wanted it to sound and the scale of it? How did that come together? What did you do to that song?
Oh, okay, so that was the most challenging scene to visualize of the film, and I spent 65% of the animation budget creating a sequence I ended up throwing away. Because it was how do you interpret, what is the visual interpretation of that sort of alien landscape, and to me, after I started using Fantasia as a reference point, and it was awful, and then I came across Stan I remembered Stan Brakhage, which, if you know Brackage's work, we pretty much did homages to Generous. We pretty much
Daylight Robbery,
yeah. I just find that song, that moment in the film, to be it's like one of these moments you as a filmmaker you try to arrive at, where you feel like, okay, I've earned this. We've been talking, we've been setting it up, and now it's interesting you bring that up, because that's kind of what I imagined the entire film was going to be like. That moment where it's just like nothing is being said, but everything is being communicated. And when I think of that song, I think of Stefan Nadelman did it. Like, that to me is what that song feels like, and it's a difficult thing because it's so intangible to sort of visualize. And then I think in the offline I had put in the bass guitar, but then in the mix we stretched them out, so left, right, and then Paul did this great move when the drums come in and they sort of glide across the room. And
so Paul, you had the animation to work with when you were on that, right? So how did that sort of prompt your imagination?
Well, right from the beginning, Brett said that he wanted this to be, a theme park ride sound-wise as an overall soundtrack, just one huge dissolve, and you can shut your eyes, and sometimes it makes no difference because what you're hearing emotionally actually has nothing to do with what you're seeing on the screen in many areas of the film. So, I mean, we just had the liberty to experiment. We had a lot of the tracks separate, and Brett had some fantastic ideas that got me to really push some boundaries of traditional film mixing that I discovered. I'd put these boundaries around myself in terms of how they translate into different formats and how they translate it to home theater and such. And Brett was like, let's discard all of those. What's wrong with panning those drums all the way around the room? And what's wrong with, just going beyond? And I think there was a sequence where we could just be at liberty to do what we felt was emotionally correct for the audience.
I think there'll be things I notice every time I go back and watch this film again, not or in the sounds just as much as in the visuals. And in fact, I did notice something just bobbing in a second ago with Paul to catch the last 15 minutes or so. It was during the word on a wing scene there near the end. And I suddenly realized how well the piano in that sequence tessellates with the tap dancing of Fred and Ginger. And so perhaps you two could talk about that. Finding that kind of footage and those kind of juxtapositions must have been quite exciting.
That particular tapping you're talking about, that took a little bit of time to try and get that to work with the music and sort of roughly so it felt like it was connected in a way. We went back and forth on that a few times. But there were many instances, but one of the most exciting things about the soundtrack really was as Brett was saying earlier, when we first had these sort of sessions with Brett where we were literally discussing almost every single second of the film in quite great detail, about the idea that about the sound not actually being that tied to the image, and the sound being almost sort of explaining a different journey to what it would traditionally do. In actual fact, it's sort of closer to what a music score would do, where it plays sort of the emotion inside someone's head, or it plays something. We were constantly trying to do that and trying to break new boundaries, but also we were also trying to use as much Bowie material as we possibly could. So the great thing about having all the multi-tracks, all the separation, meant that we could also sort of incorporate bits and pieces from sort of Bowie's music into the design as well. Things like backing vocals or sort of distorted backing vocals. You hear the synth part of Station to Station coming in when he's moving on. Things like that. So it feels like it's all come from Bowie's world.
That leads me perfectly to another favourite bit, which hopefully Nina can talk about, which is the piano solo from Aladdin Sane, Mike Garson's legendary one-take solo towards the end of that song, which you have over the kind of cokey scene of him in the back of a limo in LA. Is it LA or where is it? In fact, LA, yeah. Talk about that, because that, again, works so well psychologically.
Yeah, well, we were definitely layering up all sorts of sounds to try and get into Bowie's head. So much of the work we were doing on this, as we've all talked about, was not necessarily linking to the images that you see, but you're trying to get deeper inside the essence of Bowie. And, we're journeying through the film and seeing where he is at different stages. It's not necessarily chronological, but it's different ideas that have come to him over his life and how he has evolved. And that obviously is an area that's very, very sort of hectic and lots of unease and quite a lot of torment going on. He's not quite sure, he's out at sea, and we used all sorts of different layers of sounds to represent that, which are woven in. And even watching it again today, actually, I'm hearing, I know what it's in there, but different things are catching my ear as I listen to it each time. And this is one of the great things about this film, is there's so much watchability to it. You can watch it over and over again, and it feels like a new experience each time. That whole immersive nature from the sound and the images, you just, you go with it each time, and you come out of it feeling something slightly different. I enjoyed Let's Dance. It was my favourite song this time around, There
was a good sound in the Aladdin Sane solo, as well as the sound of a wooden a bowling ball rolling down an alley and firing over the wooden pins. And we talked about this a lot, about how sort of all these sounds have kind of like almost like a tension and release to them. And there were all kinds of sounds like wooden roller coasters. There's wooden roller coasters that kind of go up a hill and then they take off. You'll hear those sounds in there as well. So in the Aladdin Sane one, that was where we put the 10-pin bowling.
I think one of the things that we all had to do with this film, we took our cue from David in that we all had to get out of our comfort zone in order to access Bowie's techniques and methodologies. And I'm so glad you brought up Aladdin Sane, because I think when I was saying we wrote the film in the spotting sessions and then in the mix, there are things that are happening in the mix during Aladdin Sane that are of greater importance than any visuals or any text that's being stated. When we were mixing that scene, we talked about how it's like it's going off the rails, it's going off the tracks, and there's parts of it where we were stepping on dialogue on intentionally, and this is where I think for Paul spent his whole life, knowing you're not supposed to do that.
You have to hear the dialogue.
And I feel bad sometimes where I'm like, oh, they must think Paul kind of lost his way here. Why can't we hear David? But it was that sort of like, it was like, no, step on it, roll over him. And it's because it's like wobbly. It's like, it's dangerous. It's going to, and so because there's really limited footage of David in LA outside of the film Cracked Actor, we had to create that mind, his headspace. And it was really predominantly, it was montage, but really I think in that section, the sound design through the lead into Cracked Actor, Aladdin Sane, that created that kind of the chaos, the fragmentation, the kind of the sort of the reason the film's got an M rate, a 15, I think, is the sound. There's no violence, there's no sex, and there's no profanity. Why did we get a 15?
Just sheer sonic aggression.
Sorry. Well, it's because it's like implied. You think things are happening that they're like not happening, but like it's like, I mean, when we got the 15, I had my assistant go through the film. I'm like, why? He goes, there's 1 second and 18 frames of nudity spread out over 4 shots.
I'm going to throw it open to you guys in 1 second, so think of some questions if you can. We'll have about 10 minutes left. But I just wanted to pick you up on the chronology idea that Nina mentioned earlier, because I feel like we get a sense of chronology, but it's not laid on too heavy. And that must have been quite a difficult balance to strike, when you were crafting the entire concept of the film, but also with the sound journey as well. Figuring out how to sort of tell the story without it always seeming too chronological, if you like.
Yeah, it's interesting. Bowie, talks about how his career is not a straight line. It zigzags, and I think more so than most artists, he consistently returns to various themes and ideas. Some of the ideas and conceptions that he was working on with Low, he comes right back to with Outside, and he's just constantly going back and forth. Probably the best representation or example that I discovered of that was the connection between Silly Boy Blue, song from 1967, and Black Star, one of his last songs, that share the same melody at the end of Silly Boy Blue, the ooh. So he's constantly going back and forth. So from conception, I wanted to sort of bend time. I didn't want it to be linear, and I wanted the freedom to be able to use images where I wanted to. I love this idea of David singing about himself, using images of him from the 80s to visualize Free Cloud, and to have him in 73 doing Ziggy, singing Rock and Roll Suicide, narrating about his future self. So that idea of having conversations across time was something I found very intriguing and very kind of true to David's kind of artistic sense.
I think I remember another one that you mentioned when we first met. All the Young Dudes, the melody comes back, doesn't it? Da, 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 da.
There's an a cappella in the background vocals tracks for the song Move On.
That's it.
Yeah, I found that, and I didn't know what it was, and my wife's like, it's all the Young Dudes. And I'm like, oh, you're right, it's all the Young Dudes. But it was weird that it was buried on the background vocal track to the song Move On, 5 years later.
Okay, guys, it's your turn. So, yeah.
Hello, I'm Tracy Fatchell. Nice to meet you and thank you for the film. My question is, well, firstly, I'd like to say that you really do go on a journey. It's like being on a roller coaster and getting subliminal messages through sound. I didn't know that could happen, so thank you for that experience. My question is, clearly Mr. Bowie made quite an impression on each of you. I wonder if you wanted to talk about the first time you ever heard him or saw him on television, what that felt like, how it changed your way of thinking, as you know, personally or as an artist. And if I could ask cheekily, did he live up to your expectations when or if you ever met him?
I have never met David Bowie, much as I would love to have done, but I feel like I know him quite well through this movie now. I mean, musically, I'm a child of the 80s, so I kind of grew up through that Modern Love, Let's Dance era and loved all that music. And I've actually grown to learn a lot more about David through this film and learn a lot more about his music. So he's featuring on my playlist an awful lot more than he was previously. But I'm sure Brett could probably talk about David.
I will say this, which I did have an opportunity to meet David, but I think more apropos is I spent 2 years reviewing every piece of media in existence on David. And that experience of viewing all the material far transcended any expectation that I ever could have had I've never been more in awe of a human. I don't know how, I know that sounds like a strange sentence, but you would think when you see everything that they start to become, you start to see them in more sort of familiar light. And David was so intelligent, so generous, so present, and open to experience. And I think of all the material that I came across, people will often ask, what was the one piece of media you wish you could have used that you didn't put in the film? It's the one thing that always comes to my mind is this interview that David did in 1987 with Entertainment Tonight in Canada. And it was this really daft lifestyle reporter who, and this was at a time of Bowie's career where he wasn't being interviewed by rock journalists. They were, the People magazine and the sort of more journalists who weren't familiar with his work. And there was a pre-roll to this interview, and during the pre-roll, David spent 20 minutes talking to this very young reporter about a book he had just read, trying to get suggestions from her, and they were having this whole thing. And I realized in that moment, I'm like, David views every moment as an opportunity for an exchange. And that to me was really, I think, my great takeaway from 7 years immersed in his work and his life and his art. I believe he says something in the film that I think is sort of false, which is when he says that when you get to a point in life when you realize you've lived more days than you have in front of you is when you can really start to appreciate life. I think David had an appreciation for the brevity of life from the very beginning, where for me it took till I was 50. I think at the start he realized, and as he said, went about having the greatest adventure of any person he knew.
That is totally what I get from it as well, and in quite an overwhelming way. Thank you. We'll take a question from the back here. There were two people, I think, but yes.
Sorry, hi. Sam here. Firstly, thank you so much. As a lifelong Bowie fan, it was an incredibly immersive and special experience. And for me, it was meditational throughout. And as much as I got inside Bowie's head, something you all spoke about during the making of the film, I also found at times I was looking in on myself and decisions I've made and, how you can do more by being so inspired. And was this, I suppose, a question to Brett, was it a conscious decision when making the film to look at inspiring people, not just inspired through Bowie, but to change themselves?
Well, I think the more we listen to David Bowie, the more we learn about ourselves. I don't know David Jones, and I don't know if listening to Bowie's music brings me closer to David Jones. And I think that Bowie is while all artists are inviting the audience to project, we don't all construct our art with that intent, thinking about that. But I think it was something that Bowie very consciously did. And he talks about, during the Ziggy section, inviting the audience to kind of project and fill in the blanks. And so the film was constructed very much with that intent, that it was designed to invite the audience to kind of project onto the screen and to ultimately reflect back onto their own lives. So what you experienced was very deliberate, intentional, by design, and I'm very grateful and appreciative that you had that experience. It's clearly my Bowie because I'm the artist, but I really tried to make it so that we can all find our own Bowie in the film. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks for that. Do we have anyone over on this side? I can't quite see, but oh yeah, there's someone bang in the middle actually. Middle. Can we have this gentleman?
Hi, John. Hi, Nina. Hi, Paul. Good friends. Wow, telling the story with sound as a key integrated piece of the heart of the movie. We were taken inside. It's just a beautiful, beautiful journey that you've presented here in a way that is it's definitely out there. Definitely out there. It's. I think your risk taking is paying off enormously, and I just want to express gratitude for the fine art work that you guys have done with the fine artwork of David Bowie. So that's it.
Thanks for that, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
We've got probably time for one more, I think. Yeah. So there's someone here.
I think you answered the first. I was going to ask two quick questions. The first was family involved, and you mentioned Mr. Jones was not by implication. Secondly, given the wealth of material, I can understand it to a large extent, but you kept very far away, except for his last work, from the last 10 years of his life when he knew things were happening that were going to shorten it. Is that a deliberate decision or just not enough material?
Well, no. When you're doing a film about an artist who has a 50-year career, to avoid it being cliff notes to history, one has to pursue a through line. So obviously, I didn't deal with the first 9 years of his career either. I decided to open the film with Ziggy, sort of where the public, sort of for the most part, was introduced to him. And the journey that the film takes us on is basically David learning how to create art without having to put himself in harm's way. And when he meets Aman, he's arrived at a point in his creative pursuits where he can actually create music from his home, which is what he did. He built a home studio, and he was able to create a series of amazing albums from '94 to Black Star. But my narrative had been satiated, and to go beyond that would have been to simply check off, and then he did this one, and then he did this one, and then he did this one. So it was never an attempt to be completist. I think that that would have, the film's already long as it is. So it was certainly my favorite album's Outside, and my second favorite album's Heathens. So it had nothing to do with my interests or tastes. It was very much about where the narrative sort of demanded the film, asked me to take the film to, if that helps. To your first question about the family, there's a fairly significant separation between church and state with the family and the estate in terms of day-to-day handling of things. We had the full blessing and support of the family and the estate, who've been really amazing and hands-off the entire way. In fact, the only thing that Bill Zisblatt, David's executive, said to me at the beginning was, David's not here to approve or authorize the film, so it's never going to be Bowie on Bowie. it's going to be your interpretation of Bowie, and you need to embrace that. And you know, that's kind of a very strange thing in this day and age for an artist as large as David Bowie, for their estate to sort of say, okay, we'll see what happens. But I think that they viewed it as an artistic endeavor, not a corporate endeavor. And so I think the executor's background is in accounting, so I don't think he wanted to get into like giving me notes or anything.
I'm going to end, in fact, with a question for Paul. From the sound of things, Bowie's own sort of boundary-pushing attitude to his life and to his art and to his aesthetic kind of encouraged you or inspired you to cross certain boundaries professionally that you've not done before. Is that what you felt day to day when you were working on this?
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, we were mixing this over about 14 months or so. Not constant, obviously. We do about a 5-week block, and then we come back 2 months later. But that process allowed Brett to go away and make the film evolve a little more, and then it would come back. We were all able to look at it fresh. And I think that constantly made us feel like we actually didn't achieve what we thought we achieved last time. Now we've got to do more. And so I know within my own personal life too, once we got to the end of the mix and Brett finally said, we're finished, which I didn't think that day would ever come, by the way. I now look at some of the things that he said that Brett mentioned, like, you know, don't waste any time in a day. And if I find myself like, oh, I wish it was time to go home from work and all the rest, I've changed that attitude within myself. And so I think as the film evolved, my perception of David and my understanding of the boundaries that we can cross changed, for sure.
I mean, the sheer layers of this film are incredible, and I truly think it is one of the great music documentaries ever made. And thousands, if not tens of thousands of those layers were supplied by you guys. So I'd like to thank you for that work and also for being here. And if you could join me in thanking the whole team.